All right, welcome to the Brains and Banter Podcast. We're here with a very cool and inspiring Jeremy Lent. He has an incredible new book. So his first play was The Patterning Instinct, which is just phenomenal. And his new book, I have it and it's very marked up. So it's called The Web of Meaning, and integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe, and just all about our interconnectedness. And you get into so many different types of sciences. You have complexity, chaos theory, systems science. And I think, do you find that part of the goal in writing this book, so you're showing the importance of our interconnectedness, but that also we have to combine disciplines in order to really bring that about? Like, it's sort of combining disciplines to create that harmony you talk about in your book?
Yes, I think it's a lot to do with combining stuff. And I actually, on my website, I refer to myself as like an author and integrator. And to me, integration is absolutely key, both to making sense of our world in a truly meaningful way. And also, really, it's inspired by what we discover happens in nature. And I mean, this is really a big sort of theme in the book itself, is how integration is a key part of every living system, and is a key part of us actually making the fullness of our experience on this earth, really.
And so when you say integration, like, we do know the definition, but do you want to say more about it just in case people need a
yeah, because it is one of those words which could be defined differently by different people. And for most of us, it might be a little fuzzy what it even means anyway. Like, obviously something to do with coming together, but what exactly? And I actually love the way that the neurobiologist Dan Siegel talks about integration. And it's this notion, and I sort of define it in my glossary in the book too, but above all, it's about unity with differentiation. And that's the key element to it, because in an integrated system, all the different parts of the system act as one in a coherent whole. But it's not like this kind of mush where, everything is just sort of all mixed together and they lose their individuality. So each individual part also gets to be its fullest self, even as part of that whole. And that, to me, is a key in both how we can develop flourishing societies, how we can actually be a whole person within ourselves, with all the different parts of ourselves, and is a key also to just making sense of how we get meaning out of the world in terms of integrating the different parts of what we can recognize a part of our beings, like our thinking processes, our bodily felt emotions, like, say, philosophical understandings, engagement, and spiritual seeking, along with political activism. All of these things, rather than being separate, a big part of what my book is about is they're actually part of an integrated whole, using that integration concept the way I described it.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I love that idea of it, sort of diversity in unity, right? And so it functions better, is more enriched. You make this beautiful comparison in one of the lectures I wrote about, like, music notes. So you play a note on a piano and then you play a different note, but when they come together, it's something more enriching. And I wanted to start and then got excited to talk about integration. But so one of your main premises then is the idea of our current sort of modern myth about separation and how we're separated from one another and from the earth. And so what sort of brought you to looking at this and sort of recognizing there's this culture of separation and that we need to learn to live in harmony? Was there something specific, or have you always been interested in this type of thing?
Well, it was really a whole sort of transition in my life, really a meltdown in my life that I went through that caused me to really try to make sense of where meaning actually comes from in life. Like, I'd actually in the first part of my life, even though actually as an undergraduate in Cambridge in England, I was a radical. I was living in a squat and just didn't want to be part of this kind of established system. I actually came to the United States and ended up starting an internet company. I got an MBA, and was with somebody who'd been a hippie, but who wanted to sort of, quote, go straight, so we could we could raise what became my two stepsons and give them the best start in life and all this stuff. And then I went through a period when everything collapsed around me. The company that I had started, I took public, and then my wife, who passed away some years back, my first wife, she became seriously sick with the whole process that would lead to her to pass. And I left the company to look after her. The company then collapsed. Meanwhile, I kind of lost her even while she was still alive. She went through borderline dementia and went through years of almost like a purgatory in my life when I lost contact with people I knew. And it felt like everything had crashed. But I was determined that I wasn't just going to sort of give up on things. I wanted to make sure that whatever I did with my life moving forward would truly be meaningful. And I started this deep inquiry into, well, what is meaning? I wanted to make sure that whatever it was something where I wasn't taking somebody else's words for it, where I was actually figuring out in that integrated way. I wanted something that my mind could, my sort of cognitive intelligence could rationally buy into, but that felt right to me too. And that felt like a real challenge. And for years, I started reading and reading, trying to understand where our concepts originally came from. It was a little bit like peeling the onion when I was going back in time and going from things like philosophy, then to neuroscience and cognitive anthropology and all different fields. And as I did that, I was actually going through my own embodied journey of discovering things like meditation and traditional Chinese energy practices like Qigong, and looking for a way that it could all make sense. And it did finally come to make sense to me. And it's really in that first book, The Patterning Instinct, and in this new book, The Web of Meaning, integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe, that I really wanted to share how I've tried to make sense of this kind of weave of integrating all these parts together.
That's so beautiful. I'm really so sorry about your wife and your first wife. And I find that the only way to get through that deep sorrow is, I find, learning, right? And finding meaning. And so it's the whole process of searching for answers. And in doing that, it leads to something else and then leads to something else. So it is, and look what you've created from, I can't imagine that process of getting to that. But do you find then that the works are also like a work of love, kind of like a testament to this idea of life enduring and life having meaning and that sort of thing?
Yes, very much. Thank you for asking that question, because that is just so true of what it's felt like for me. That first book I wrote, The Patterning Instinct, was more of a cognitive work. It's really looks at the ways different cultures have made sense of the universe, all the way from hunter-gatherer times to the present. My heart was in it, but it was very much like an intellectual exercise to a large degree. This new book, The Web of Meaning, has been very much me sharing what is the most deeply meaningful perception and understanding that I've achieved in my life. And it's very much a work of love, especially I even, towards the end of the book, define love in terms of this kind of worldview of connectedness and sort of systems understanding, which is really like, the simple definition is something like the realization and embrace of connectedness. And so very much to me, this was this expression of that, in really the deep intention to see if by sharing this, it can help others to not so much to come to the same understanding that I have, but to offer a platform for other people to weave their own web of meaning, essentially, and find their own place in this kind of connected universe of which we're all part.
Yeah, it so does that too. It's just remarkable. And you also mentioned meditation, and then your book is kind of provides in written form what meditation seems to provide, right? Once you get to that point where you dissolve the ego, and then you're in this state, you feel like the state of unity where, and so your book sort of just teaches us that we don't have to hang on to this separate sense of self all the time, and that we're actually multiple and fractal and all of that. So speaking of fractals, I've been obsessed with them for so long. And so yeah, that's also why I just got into your work. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why fractals are important to what you're doing, and explain what they are to people who may not know.
Yeah, fractals ended up really playing a big role in this book, even more than I'd realized when I was first beginning it. And fractals can be understood in simple terms, just simply as patterns that repeat themselves at different scales. And what systems scientists and biologists have begun to discover is that actually fractals are a sign of self-organization in nature. And what's fascinating is that they're everywhere in nature. You see fractal patterns really in everything as tiny as a cell, in the ways in which different connections get made within a single cell. You see them in the way our neurons connect in the brain. You see them in leaves. You see them in essentially almost every natural formation. And they're not just visual in terms of these kind of cool, like fractal patterns that look so great, but they're also patterns in time. And so when you look at the way different systems express themselves in time, you see the sort of ups and downs also show fractal patterns. So if you look at human self-organized systems, say like a stock market, you can look at how patterns of an index might change within a day, and then a month, and then a year, and then 10 years. And you'll see similar fractal dynamics there too. So fractals play a big part, and they're really, what is so key about them is this recognition that our very lives themselves are fractal, in the sense that the principles that drive cellular self-organization are the same underlying principles that drive an organism's way of organizing, that drive communities, and that drive really the whole of the life system on Earth. We could call it Gaia if we want, or just the Earth system. And once we realize that, it has profound implications for how we recognize our own identity within the larger systems, and also the smaller systems within us.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's also part of understanding who we are. Then understanding fractals is sort of necessary to an understanding of that, which is interesting, and which brings me back to the book itself, so we can sort of introduce it a bit better, because I just jumped right in there. But if you could describe the book in a couple sentences for the audience, would you feel comfortable doing that? And then, I think it's just, and then the question. So it addresses like, who am I? Why am I here? That sort of thing. If you talk about that too, it would be fabulous.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, basically, in essence, what this book is about how our current dominant worldview is not just dangerous, and as many people are becoming aware, driving us to this precipice where our very civilization itself may be at risk from our destructive global actions. So it's not just dangerous, but it's plain wrong. What people think is like scientifically valid stuff that they just take for granted turns out to be just ideas that developed mostly in Europe by a few white males in the 17th century that have become so embellished and so ingrained within the ways people think that we just assume it's scientifically true, when actually decades now of modern scientific research has shown almost every one of these precepts to be wrong. And so what the book does is, it's to your what you were just mentioning about the big questions in life, it's actually structured according to these kind of big existential questions in life that probably every human being at some point asks themselves in one way or another. Things like, who am I? And where am I? What am I? How should I live? Why am I? And in each of these sections, it shows how the answer that's given by our dominant worldview is wrong. And then it shows how modern scientific insights actually lead to the same deep understanding that wisdom traditions from around the world, indigenous knowledge, Buddhism, Taoism, and what I explain in the book is Neo-Confucianism, other traditional Chinese thoughts, actually have been saying for millennia, which is at the deepest level that we're all interconnected. And the way we make sense of things has to start from that very basis.
I love that. Just I have so many things to say to that, but the idea of, like Buddhism and how neuroscience is still catching up to Buddhism when it comes to consciousness too, right? And just how important it is to go back to those cultures and all that traditional wisdom, and you can learn so much from it. And also the idea that so Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the creature asked those exact questions, right? He's like, who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose?
Right.
And he learns it through reading, which is really interesting too. But Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is this, well, for her, a modern myth, right? Frankenstein, yes, or the modern Prometheus. And she does create this new myth and shows how, with Victor Frankenstein being this psychopathic scientist without any care for nature. So he treats nature as a resource. And so then nature turns against him, right? And so it's like that modern idea. Now we're in that capitalist mindset where everything's about greed and getting ahead and making money. And so the actual, like, our mindset is psychopathic. And I know you talk about the psychopathic mindset too, right? So how do you think that we can, because it's such an ingrained way of living now, what do you think we need to do in order to shift everything?
Yes, well, that's a great question. I think that the first thing people really need to do, and I imagine many people listening to this podcast have already got to that place, but really I think it begins with this kind of recognition that something is wrong. And that may be, and really what I'm really describing is what Buddhism sort of talks about. There's the beginning of the spiritual path. In the Buddhist language, they call it dukkha, or which is sometimes just translated as like a sense of suffering, but it's much broader than that. It's much more just the sense of something that isn't quite right, and that's the sense of separation that, to some degree, is actually there in the human condition, as I describe, which arises from the way we have a sort of a split human consciousness, but in our modern society, it goes far beyond that. And we actually live in a society that instills in us this sense of separation within ourselves, separation from other people. We're told we're separate individuals, and our job is to just be as successful as possible and have as high a status as possible. We're told that we're separate from nature. And that nature doesn't even have any intrinsic value or meaning. It's just this kind of resource. And that's what we're told as the sort of ingrained assumptions of this dominant worldview. But very many of us feel that's wrong, even if we don't know why. And I describe in the book, we feel that's wrong because that goes against our actual nature, our nature as living entities that just knows in what I call our animate intelligence that that's not the case. And it goes against our actually evolved human nature, which is to be cooperative and is to be part of group identity. So I think this whole process begins with this recognition that something's wrong, and then being curious to understand where that feeling of something wrong comes from. And then I think can unfold from there.
Yeah, that's so important. Yeah, just the awareness itself being so key.
Yes.
It comes from, things like meditation too. And then you learn to pay attention and how important that is. Also the idea of cooperation being part of who we are too. I studied Adam Smith and some of the moral sense philosophers for my dissertation when I was talking about sympathy. And I know you talk about invisible hand and all this. And so I was curious what you think about, so I know there's the Hobbes version where we're all selfish, or Dawkins and the selfish gene. But then I think it's interesting, Adam Smith wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is all about the importance of sympathy and how we can't function without it. But then also wrote The Wealth of Nations, which seems to be like a handbook for capitalism almost. So as you were reading, did you find sort of these sort of back and forth arguments going on between different thinkers? Is that like a common sort of question that kept coming up, or do you think it's more recently that we're realizing that things aren't great?
I think it's probably more of a recent thing, except of course we can go back to the 19th century and see somebody like Karl Marx recognizing what's actually going on in this society as industrialization unfolds around him. But honestly, and you probably have a better feeling about this than me, having studied Adam Smith in depth, but my sense is that he'd probably be turning in his grave right now if he understood how neoliberal ideology has taken and sort of basically subverted some of his ideas and statements to make him the sort of grandfather, if you will, of this kind of neoliberalism, where my sense is that he would disavow it utterly and completely. In just the same way that I think Charles Darwin would disavow the whole sort of selfish gene modern synthesis of biology. And he was one of the people who recognized that actually it was, a defining quality of humanity was its sense of group identity and its moral and, the humanity's ability to have a moral intelligence. But I do think that what we see is over the centuries, from this scientific revolution in the 17th century all the way to the 20th century, we see this kind of accretion, if you will, of these core ideas where thinkers one generation after the next use these ideas to create a very big, grandiose, kind of shiny structure of our modern global capitalist system with these sort of core things that we're sort of meant to take for granted. But I use this analogy in my book of a faulty foundation. That actually, if you're building a one-story house and you got some flaws in the foundation, well, you'll probably get away with it. You put the walls up, you walk around, you put the floor down, and you don't really notice. But then if you keep building that story after story until you're 20, 30 stories high, if there's faults in the foundation, they're going to cause some serious problems. And that's what I think we're looking at right now. We're looking at these ideas, for example, that humanity is separate from nature, and humanity's role is to exploit and to sort of conquer nature, if you will. Nature's just this resources machine. These ideas in the 19th century, when the world was still mostly still free and hadn't been utterly dominated by civilization, quote unquote, at that point in time, it was possible, for example, in economics, to consider natural resources as being free. And you could develop the whole science of economics based on not looking at any cost to externalities. You can't do that in this world where we have driven this consumption of nature to the very extremes. And yet we're still basing our theories of economics or our views of looking at global systems and coming up with technological solutions, quote unquote, to what are deep systemic problems. We're still using this flawed methodology, and that's where we can't afford to do that anymore.
So that's so well said. Absolutely. And there needs to be real systemic change. And I think what you're doing is really helping. Absolutely. And there are so many questions. Like before, I need to go back to like Charles Darwin and Erasmus Darwin, and then Adam Smith, totally turning his grave as a result of it. But yeah, Charles Darwin, I have so many quotations about him saying that sympathy is like the key to all life and that we're all interconnected through this mechanism of sympathy. And then Erasmus Darwin wrote The Temple of Nature, I think is the poem. And it's just, it's all about how we're all connected through the natural world. And then there's William Wordsworth's idea of like in his poetry, that pantheistic view.
Right.
Anyway, so it's
love that line of his, something far more deeply interfused. It's such a beautiful line. It really captures something.
Really, right. Because you studied, I did my PhD in English Lit at Oxford. And so I forgot you were at Cambridge.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, I did my undergraduate in English Lit at Cambridge. And so, those romantic poets meant a lot to me. I was total fan of each of the Coleridge and Blake and the early Wordsworth.
Yeah. Blake's so revolutionary and his ideas on perception are so cool. Do you feel like, because I felt like it was through English because it gets you when you're reading, it's all about finding meaning and finding patterns. And if you read enough, then you'll get one reference. But if you read more, you're going to get more references. The more you read, the more you'll get out of a single work. I'm forgetting my point right now because I'm so excited. So we'll edit this part out. But did that sort of pave the way for the research you're doing now and for this idea?
Yeah, that's a great question. It did in a way. I mean, as I was describing, the first half of my life, after I graduated from Cambridge, I kind of left academia behind, I did an MBA, and then got into business. And for years of my life, I didn't even read a single book. The most I'd read would be an article in Business Week or whatever it might be. And then when I rediscovered reading, I was like this starved, I was so voracious. I just dove into it and haven't sort of looked back since. And in fact, the way I did that, my own research, was actually through bibliographies and footnotes. When I'd be reading a book that was explaining something to me, and I found some insight that led to an understanding that was different from what I'd understood before, I'd look at what was being referenced by the author in the bibliography, and they go, okay, this is where I need to explore more. And so it was a little bit like a fractal web, if you will, looking at my research investigation, because one sort of foray would lead to a whole new opening of something else, which then led to a whole new opening of something else, mostly through footnotes and references.
Absolutely. It's dangerous though, too. So like, okay, now I have 500 books to read.
Right, exactly.
It's amazing.
So there's a lot of prioritization is required. Yeah, exactly.
Cool. But it is like, it's totally like the fractal thing. Like you have you have this one start, and then you have infinite potential, and you could go this way, and then from here you go this way, and then you have the the human brain, then
right, exactly.
Or a galaxy, or it's just so does that give you, so by getting into different traditions like Taoism, has that sort of, do you feel that you have a strong sense of spirituality as well? Has it done that? Or
very, very much so. I mean, this was one of the biggest interrogations that I conducted over the years, because I wanted my understanding of things to be both really appealing to my reason as well as my heart, if you will. And then I'd started off by reading the Dawkins type things, or the Stephen Weinberg type understandings, the reductionist understanding of the universe, which is basically, okay, the universe is essentially meaningless unless you want to believe in some God out there. And it's just these billiard balls hitting each other with no more meaning than that. And then the selfish gene, and well, I guess we're just driven by these genes. And I was ready to believe it, if that had to be the case, even if it didn't feel like a very satisfying response to things. But then as I read further, and I read systemic complexity theory understandings of the universe and life, I realized that what these people were saying was making this ontological leap that was every bit as much of a leap of faith as somebody saying, oh, I believe in God created the universe. They were saying, because reductionism works really well in science to understand how the parts work, we should then apply it to everything in the universe, and we should invalidate any other way of making sense of the universe that's not reductionist. That is a leap of faith. And that's where, and I described this in the book, that actually if you look at the more of a systems way of understanding things, you recognize that the relationship between things oftentimes is more important than the things themselves. And that's true whether you're looking at relationships within a cell, neurons in the brain, weather systems on Earth. Every time, this is what's so important. And as you look at the relationship between things, this is where there's this intersection with spirituality. And in fact, you can begin to understand the very notion of spirit itself as being, rather than this kind of woo-woo concept that indigenous tribes might have had, but we now know that there's no such thing. You can, once you look at things from a complexity standpoint, you recognize that there's a certain emergent coherence within a system that is unique to that system, that can't be pinned down. And the fact that you can't measure it, because it's always, basically it's always flowing, it undergoes what's called reciprocal causality, which means that all the parts affect the whole, even while the whole is affecting the parts. So by definition, it's not just you can't measure it in sort of epistemologically, by definition, it can't be measured, even in principle, because of the fact that it's its own system. And then you begin to realize that, well, that's like the spirit of a human being or a tree or an ecosystem is that coherent whole. So you can begin to identify spirituality itself is really focusing your attention on the relationships between things rather than just on the things themselves. So one of the big messages that I have in the book is that we don't have to choose between rationality and spirituality, that we don't have to believe in some made up dimension, that there's some sort of God out there who created the universe and science will never understand it. And so it's kind of, we don't have to go there. We can look at the laws of physics, these fundamental laws that are the basis for all that we know. And we can recognize that on top of those laws are these principles of complexity. And once we realize that, we realize that the place for spirituality exists within our lives, within life, and within the universe, not external, which is essentially what Taoism and Buddhism tell us. That's their way of making sense of things, looking at what's known as immanence rather than just transcendence as a way of understanding deep meaning.
Well, that is incredibly beautiful. And yeah, that sort of speaks to the next part I wanted to get into, was like the idea of life force, that chi, and then the idea of Li. And then you actually have that Liology. Is it an institute? That sounds amazing.
Right.
And so, yeah,
exactly.
I'd love to hear more about that too, and how that connects, because it all connects to everything else.
Right. Sure. Exactly. Yeah. Well, this is actually, it's kind of interesting because as I was talking about my own exploration of trying to understand these things over the years, and the concept of Li played a key part in this. As I was beginning to read complexity science, and like somebody who was very influential for me was Stuart Kaufman, who's a superb thinker at from the Santa Fe Institute, who's really deep. He's deep in biology and neuroscience, complexity science, and he writes books with titles like "At Home in the Universe," whatever, where he looks at these principles of self-organization and recognizes that they imply something much greater than just the scientific sort of empirical sense-making or whatever. And he was saying at some point, this leads us to new territory, something like these principles of organization that we're uncovering lead us to a place that we've never even been before. And right at that same time, I was reading about traditional Chinese thought, and this great historian called Joseph Needham wrote like 26 volumes of the study of Chinese thought and Chinese version of scientific thought. And he was explaining about this Neo-Confucian concept of Qi and Li, where Qi refers to basically we can think of that in modern terms as matter and or energy, the stuff of the universe. But what these Neo-Confucians, who are basically a school of thinkers from the Song dynasty in China about 1,000 years ago, as they were trying to understand a comprehensive systemic understanding of the universe, they realized that all that Qi related to itself and under certain principles of organization. And their word for that was this ancient Chinese word Li, which initially meant things like the patterns of markings in jade or whatever. So it was a sense of these kind of complex patterns. And they realized that you only got to experience matter or energy, whether it's wind or your body or earth or whatever it is, based on the ways in which this Qi self-organized. So I was going down both these paths at the same time, and I realized that while Stuart Kaufman was talking about principles of organization as being this brand new thing we've never uncovered before, here were these school of thinkers 1,000 years ago talking about essentially the same thing, the way in which everything self-organizes, and they were developing a whole way of understanding the world based on that. And that's what was called Li. So the concept behind Liology is this notion of quite explicitly taking and making a new word, a neologism from two different traditions, the Li and the ology being this Greek reason sort of sense of using scientific understanding to understand the world, whether it's biology or whatever it might be. So this concept of Liology is to essentially do what the Neo-Confucians wanted to do. They had this concept of Ge Wu, they called it, which can be translated as the investigation of things. And their investigation of things wasn't like so much like the scientific revolution investigation of seeing themselves as separate from nature and understanding the ways in which all the different parts came together. Their investigation of things was like a qualitative investigation to understand how humans were part of this much bigger system and what that meant for how we should live our lives. So the idea behind Leology is really to offer a modern version of that gawu, that investigation of things, in an embodied investigation, one that is both using our minds to understand cognitively and using our bodies to feel into what it means to be a living human on this earth and what it means to be part of this connected whole.
Ooh, yeah, it's just so neat when you think about when you think about like this one cell, and then there's this and this and this, and then now I'm me, and then but I'm within this, and then we're part of the universe, right. And how it's all expanding. It makes me think of, I think I might have mentioned, you probably know him, Tom Oliver, but yes, his work, yeah,
right. I've read his wonderful book, The Self-Delusion. I think it's great. Perfect. And some of my chapters where I talk about the I and the self, relate a lot to his work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking about that. And when you talk about the importance of integration and harmony and how that makes something more enriched and influences others. So he talks about too how when people work together, then their consciousness actually expands and expands outwards. And I think, what you're both sort of, would you say also one of the main things is to really show how we can live more compassionately and more sustainably. And the key to that then is our interconnectedness.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you bring in the word compassionately, because I think that's a key element in how we can choose to live and how our society itself can transform, that is often forgotten about, especially in this kind of polarized world we're experiencing right now. And just as I was describing the sense of love before as this realization and embrace of connectedness, I sort of think of kindness as a concept of being really this expression of a compassionate expression of connectedness, and like the very word kindness itself comes from the Old English word kin, which basically, just this recognition, sort of this notion of treating somebody as if they're kin, which in fact they are. And this is one of these great insights that modern science has now gone to understand, that every single living organism on this earth shares the same common ancestor. If we're talking about just bacteria, we might have to go back billions of years to find that shared common ancestor. But even all living mammals, we maybe go back no more than a couple of 100 million years, and in many cases less than that. And in fact, we like a banana shares about half of its genes, its DNA, with humans. Like there's this deeply shared, what's called deep homology in evolutionary biology, this shared basis of our genetic makeup. And this, of course, is what indigenous traditions around the world have been saying for millennia. Almost any indigenous culture, if you explore how they make sense of the world, they think of all nature as our relatives. They think of sort of nature itself as being essentially like a giving parent, and all other living beings as being relatives. And that doesn't mean, of course, hunter-gatherers will also hunt and will kill other creatures, but they'll do that in a different way. They'll do that with a sense of the sacredness of the spirit that they are, that they're choosing, that they're killing for their own lives, and seeing it as part of a bigger, complex ecosystem, which is exactly what now global Earth system scientists have gone to understand how ecosystems actually work. So this is a key way, and this is where compassion and kindness plays a big part in our ability to relate to all of life, and very much to other human beings. And we can come from this deep realization that we all basically want ultimately the same things. We all want to feel that sense of connectedness. We all want to feel love and warmth. And when we see people out there on the sort of polar opposite political side of the spectrum shouting slogans of hate or whatever, it's easy to other them and see them as being the enemy or whatever. But it's I think we're only going to get to a place where we need to go as a global society when we realize that these are people who have been hurt by the same processes that are oppressing those we're trying to protect too. And it's only when they get to resolve some of those deep pains within them that we can all have this potential to move towards flourishing for all society.
So exciting. Could you imagine? It's like, this is, I mean, what a new world it would be. It would be incredible. So you were talking to about, so the indigenous cultures too, this idea of like reverence, right? Is that sort of, you talk about it, the importance of reverence for life and respect and reciprocity. And that's also key. And sorry, I had something I have to go back to that I thought was so interesting when you were talking about, do you pronounce it dukkha, the term in Buddhism? And so the sense of that something isn't right. And so I was thinking about meditation and then psychedelics and fractals, and how, there was when there was this revolution with psilocybin and LSD, and how it allows you to dissolve the ego. And then you often see these fractal patterns, and then you're connected to nature. And then, so also this idea. And so that's now been, it's no longer legal. And it was because people recognize, hey, something isn't right. I could be living differently. I'm connected to people, but now, they're not legal. Whereas something like alcohol, which actually like suppresses the spirituality, is allowed. And so do you think there's something to that? Like, do you think there's actually some kind of like pernicious part of society that wants us to stay as like this? Or
well, I think that yes, is the simple answer. We basically live in a society that is the result of really what we can just identify as the patriarchy. We, for thousands of years, ever since the rise of agriculture, even early civilizations were patriarchal. And our modern society very much has this deep sense of hierarchy and patriarchy inbuilt within it, which has then been, in the last few hundred years, since the rise of this modern worldview, we've been dominated by this Western way of thinking that's been very much one based on separation, exploitation, white supremacy, and really the domination of a small group of people over most people in the world, and certainly over non-human relatives, essentially. And when people, in the 60s, when people began to use psychedelics and actually use that as powerful ways to question some of those precepts, there was definitely this clear reaction against it. I mean, one of those great slogans from the hippie area was "question authority," which, of course, authority didn't like so much.
No.
So it's no surprise that that got stamped on. And of course, nowadays people will point to somebody like Timothy Leary as being somebody who actually sort of took the cat out of the bag and created more harm than good by scaring people and all that stuff. And of course, there's now a potential renaissance in a greater acceptance, but a more mature acceptance of psychedelics. Yeah. And there are these great studies being carried out both in the UK and the US in academic institutions, looking at both the neuroscience of psychedelics and looking at the great way in which, when used in a sensible and thoughtful and very careful and rigorous and integrated way, can work for the benefit of so many people. There have been studies of people who have been through deep, intractable depression, who, when they go through, again, not just simply taking psychedelics as a one-off thing, but as part of an integrated therapeutic process, working psychedelics into that, they go from this place of separation to a place of connectedness. And it's been shown, and it's still too early to say exactly how it unfolds, but has the potential to be far more effective in treating intractable depression, in treating people looking at end-of-life issues, who are terminal cancer patients, all kinds of groups who are looking at this separation. And of course, ultimately, that group includes pretty much all of us who live in this dominant culture of separation. And I do think that psychedelics offer one pathway, if approached from the right mindset, and approached from a process of integration, and with reverence for their power, and with some sort of guide who actually has a greater understanding of how they can be used and abused. If approached in that mature way, they can be a very powerful gateway to an opening up of new ways of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find amazing is it just sort of shows you the potential, but we could get there without the psychedelics, I think that's so,
yes,
yeah, it's
exactly.
Really, but,
exactly. There are multiple pathways to really shedding some of these layers of conditioning and opening up to our deep interconnectedness.
Yeah, it's always that. This idea of opening up to, I find, is just so key. And I think the more people I meet, the more I read, I think you just realize how exciting it is to connect with people. And like I'm sweating. I'm so excited talking to you right now. So it gives you such hope, and I think, like you say, the idea of we're meaning making creatures, and we need to find, and we need a purpose. And I think, what you're doing is, your purpose is, changing the world, which is very cool, but like recognizing that there's meaning in everything, and that we need to pay attention, and that awareness is key to our flourishing as well. So do you find that with the spirituality, is that something that came through this then, or were you already a bit spiritual before all of this?
Yeah, well, that's another great question. I definitely had that sense of seeking something of deep meaning in my teens. And then when I went through this kind of diversion, if you will, in my life, I used to actually think of it almost as if even though I didn't know what it meant in those days, I used to sort of feel like as if I had taken my soul and put it in the back of the sock drawer, if you will, like sort of, well, I'll come to it at some point in the future, but I can't even think about it now. So I spent many years of my life when I was starting this business, taking this company public and all that stuff, and just putting it in abeyance. And when I re-entered trying to make sense, trying to find meaning in life, this became a very, very profound part of my life. So much so that at this point, I'd call myself really deeply spiritual. And in the sense that I have begun to sort of open up to the sense of the reverence of all nature and all life. To me, one of the statements that has resounded through me so powerfully that I really feel like I live my life according to it comes from this great humanitarian who was actually a Christian humanitarian in the 20th century, Albert Schweitzer, who made this fabulous statement at one point. Who says, "I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live." And he sort of then goes on to say, as a result of that, I cannot but have reverence for all life. So to me, that is very much a part of what it means to really live this integrated life. But it expands even more than life to really having reverence for the universe, this universe that has set the conditions for life to appear on this earth, and who knows where else in the universe it might be. And this recognition, this kind of inquiry, what does that mean to actually have reverence for everything in life? In simple terms, that's defined as pantheism, and that sense of recognizing the divinity of everything in the universe. It was something that Spinoza in the West was famous for sort of espousing, and Albert Einstein very famously talked about himself as a follower of Spinoza. And if we ask ourselves, what does that actually mean? For me, it's really come to mean really having reverence for every moment of our existence, recognizing that we ourselves, each of us, our lives are these tiny little eddies in the overall unfolding of billions of years of life on this earth. And the way we can really have the deepest gratitude and reverence for that is by taking each of those moments of our lives as this kind of sacred treasure and asking ourselves, what can we do? What can each of us do that's truly for the benefit of all life, something that's far greater than each of us, far greater even than humanity, but as part of this unfolding? And to me, what that leads to, one of the things it leads to, is this recognition that our global civilization is actively destroying the richness and abundance of life right now, which leads to feeling like we're driven to engage in the work to try to undo that destruction, not because of some sense of obligation, oh, I should do that because it's wrong, but because our embodied beingness is driving us to do that. Just the same way that if someone's hitting your arm and is beginning to cut your arm with a knife, you're going to stop it, not because you say, oh, I should do that, but because you're driven to stop that. That's what our civilization is doing right now to life on this earth.
That's very, very well said. That's a good analogy. Yeah, it's a scary time, but it's also a hopeful time. You can really see there's kind of a tipping point right now, and people are starting to change their minds and see that the system is flawed. So I think that's really exciting. And I asked before, so now I'm going back to something else because you talked about the universe. So I had this question about, I mean, it's just something. So you know how you were talking about Lee and this like organizing principle. So that makes me think of like dark energy, where we like there's like what percentage of the universe and how it's invisible and how we don't know what it is. But it makes me think of if those are like akin in any way. Probably not, but I just thought it was an interesting thought.
Yeah, well, actually, what is fascinating is if you look at the what scientists have tried to use sort of AI and stuff to map out their sense of dark energy in the universe. They've come up with these kind of conceptual sort of mappings of dark energy, and the patterns that they've arrived with look almost indistinguishable from the patterns of neuronal organization in the brain. So, you know, it's obviously there's a jump where some people can say, oh, this shows that there's this intrinsic intelligence to the entire universe. And I don't know that. And I think that's a little bit of a leap of faith. But I think what we can recognize is these deep patterns of self-organization are embedded in the universe themselves. And we can recognize, we know this as a fact, that the way the universe did evolve in its patterns of self-organization set the conditions for life to emerge on at least one planet in the universe, if not many, many, and elsewhere too. So that's something we know, and that's where we can really feel a reverence. And even if we think of the non-living part of the universe as something that doesn't have that same sort of consciousness that life itself has, we can say at the very least, it set the conditions for that consciousness to emerge.
Love it. So beautiful. I honestly just, I'm so excited to be talking to you. We'll wrap up soon. Every time you say reverence, I also think of awe. And I don't know if do you know Bo Lotto's work on the neuroscience of awe and perception?
I'm just aware of it. I don't know it well, but I've heard of it.
Cool. And so he's done studies where, similar to reverence, where people will be watching Cirque du Soleil and hooked up to EEGs or ask questions after. And it's as if as they're watching Cirque du Soleil, they step out of themselves into this shared wider experience. And so it makes me think of that idea of reverence, where you're no longer just for the self, you become part of something larger. So I think that's really important too. What you're saying is by through reverence, we can really feel our interconnectedness and see that, we're part of something much bigger. And that, we just
I think it's a great point that you raise, and it's probably worth just exploring that a little bit more. Because there's a sense, which again was something I sort of came to late in the book and late in my own work on the research and writing of the book, was this realization that our values themselves are a function of our identity. And so when we're told that our identity is this separate self that leads to values like neoliberalism or individualism above all else, or whatever it might be. But when we expand our sense of identity, not to give up our sense of self, and this is key. I mean, sometimes people go, well, I don't want to lose my sense of self, or this expansion of identity is nonsense because ultimately if I'm hungry, I need to eat. And, so the point is to recognize that when we think of identity as being fractal, it includes our separate identities as a separate organism. And it also includes our group identity with family, with our community, with maybe a shared ideology or shared group of people, of thinkers around the world, with all of humanity and with all of life. And our identity can actually dynamically flow from these different levels. They don't have to exclude one or just include one at the expense of the other. And it's when that our identity can expand and contract in that way to include all, that our values can go accordingly. And with that, I think to this kind of initial point you were making of reverence or whatever, And there are certain ways in which we can set our intentions to open up our sense of identity to these greater areas. There's this beautiful Neo-Confucian Chinese term called Ren, which basically the very ancient word itself in early Confucianism just basically meant a sense of understanding one's full humanity or humaneness or whatever. But these Neo-Confucians expanded it to be this recognition of our being part of this wonderful, incredible, complex, interconnected whole. And there was this great statement by one sage of how the universe is my father and the earth is my mother, and I, like a little child, are embedded in part of this, and all beings are my brothers and sisters. And that sense of Ren, what's so fascinating about it is the Chinese word for numbness is no Ren. In Chinese, like bu ren, which means like no Ren, essentially. So what I love about this is this recognition that when people see themselves as being these separate, autonomous identities, unrelated to the rest of the world, they think that that's their reality. It's the same thing as if somebody has been numbed by our dominant culture. So that, and imagine if you're giving an anesthetic and your hand has been numbed, somebody can touch you on the hand, but you'll say, oh, I don't feel anything. They're not touching me, because you are numb to that connection. So similarly, this kind of leads to this great insight that, yes, we are deeply interconnected. And when we don't feel it, it's not because it's not there. It's because we're suffering from bu ren, from that numbness that our dominant culture instills in us from early times onwards.
Woohoo! I was going to ask you to sum up with something, but I think that is the most, magnificent way to end. It's just so, you're such an engaging speaker and so inspiring. And like I keep saying, you provide hope, and it's, it just shows how it is possible for us to change, and that, like, we were we're innately cooperative and want to be in communion with one another and help each other. And so the more and more people are doing that, since we're an imitative species, right? We're going to imitate it. So we see someone doing good, then someone else will. So you talk about those ripples and that constant ripple effect, or like the universe expanding outwards. So the more you meet people and then they start changing their way of living, then maybe we can do it in our lifetime.
Yeah, that's the thing. And, I think that's maybe just as another place to sum up is, I feel all that thing that you're describing, and at the same time, we have to recognize the devastating path that our civilization is on right now. And there are many people who sense a sense of despair. And oftentimes when I'll talk with them, they might say, I'm happy to see how optimistic you are. I wish I could share that optimism. And I just wanted to say, it's not so much, in my view, in my case, a matter of optimism or pessimism, but it's this matter of, once we recognize that we are life as part of life, in the way that I was talking about earlier, we just have to give ourselves to that mystery and know that we will do what we can. And if enough of us interconnected through the world work in that same way, there is this potential to turn things around. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be clear for a long time if that can happen or not. But we can give ourselves, we have the choice to give ourselves to be part of this transformation that's possible. And we're all part of that. And every one of us makes that choice in every decision we make, every day that we choose to do one thing versus another, or choose not to do something, we're making those choices. And I just really want to thank you, Bryn, for what you bring, because I can feel that same energy and that same sense of deep connection, and that really being embedded in that possibility of transformation that I feel is what is absolutely the jewel, if you will, as I describe in the book, the jewel of Indra, like this deep interconnectedness that actually has this possibility of bringing that transformative change. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I feel like that from you. Totally. Just, absolutely. My heart is bursting in a good way, Yes. It'd be bad if it wasn't in a good way. But no, this has just been such a lovely conversation. You're actually offering some courses, right? Is it starting in October?
That's right.
Tell people?
Exactly. Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking about that. So if anyone's interested in this kind of work, there's actually two sets of courses I'm offering, starting actually on Tuesday, October 5th, I'm offering a 4-week course in the vision of what's called an ecological civilization, this idea of how we could actually transform our current wealth-based civilization to one that is life-based and life-affirming, and which is not just my phrase. That's this great vision that's out there that I really love to share with others. And then actually starting in November, the first Tuesday in November, I think it's November 2nd, is a 6-week course that's a guided exploration to the web of meaning, where the book itself is what we'll be exploring in 6 90-minute sessions. And each of those 6 weeks, we're going to be looking at those key questions that I mentioned the book is structured according to. Who am I? Where am I? What am I? Etc. And it'll be a chance I'll be presenting. We'll have group discussions, and it'll be just this great, exciting way to share with others these insights and what they mean for each of us.
I will be signing up for sure. And we'll also provide links to those. So yeah, just thank you so much again. It was an absolute joy getting to talk to you. And you're just an amazing person.